Excellent. So, in that case, I will hand over to Daisy.
Right. Hello, everyone. I'm Daisy Doyle, and this is Fraud, Gotta Catch Them All. So, I've worked on fraud detection across 2 companies, so the Very Group in their machine learning team, and most recently at Awaze, I joined in April in data science. So both are e-commerce, and both have a big problem of fraud. So e-commerce fraud in the UK in 2024 experienced over 3 million events, of which £1 billion was stolen. But we did prevent just under £1.5 billion, which it's something, but it's not great if you think that's only really 60% of all fraud events. But let's just think about what does fraud look like in e-commerce. So there's lots of different types. So the first one I've got here is promo abuse. So fraudsters can manipulate their email address to use the same email address to get free offers, discounts, and most user interfaces will not pick this up because this is still like a legit email address, but it's different. Another type is credit card chargeback fraud. This is when someone will receive a good or a service and say they never received it and report it as fraud, so the customer loses out, the company loses out then. And then what's really common in buy now, pay later schemes is account hijacking. So this is where a fraudster will use stolen credentials and place fraudulent orders, and then your legitimate customer gets in touch saying, I've got this bill I never placed. And then another type is triangulation. So this is where a customer places a legitimate order through a fraudster who uses a stolen credit card to place the order. The customer receives the goods or service, and then the stolen credit card reports it as being fraudulent, rightly so. So moving on, how do we actually detect fraud? So over the past 15 months, I've been working with AWS Fraud Detector. This is a fully managed fraud detection service. It takes 18 months of historical data that has known fraudulent or legitimate labels, and it builds a model. So this model is black box. I can't tell you what's going on under the hood, but I can tell you that as you put in test data, your orders will receive a fraud score between 0 and 1,000. So this is a likelihood of how fraudulent something might be, where 1,000 is very high and 0 is very unlikely to be fraudulent. And we would expect to see a distribution like this, where blue is our fraud orders and green are our legitimate orders. But something that's really important to note is we're using machine learning and AI, but we're putting in customer, personal information. So to work with GDPR laws, we always need a human reviewer to look over these before a decision is made. So I can't tell you about fraud at Very, and I can't tell you about fraud at Awaze, but I can tell you about fraud at Eevee Trading Cards and Snorlax Spa Breaks. So Eevee Trading Cards sell limited edition trading cards and through their buy now, evolve later payment scheme. Their fraud trends change sort of every 4 to 6 weeks. It's quite fast. It's based on when the new high-ticket item is released. And their fraud that they typically see is account takeover. Whereas Snorlax Spa Breaks, things move a bit slower. We notice most of the fraud around the big events in the Pokémon calendar, and we typically would expect to see credit card chargeback and triangulation fraud. So, monitoring. How do we actually catch fraud? So typically you would be looking at accuracy for some models, but if we look at accuracy with Fraud Detector, we really have to take it with a pinch of salt, because that says 1. So everything I predict should be right. But in most companies, you'll find fraud is such a small percentage of all the orders coming in, typically under 0.5%. So if my model said all of these are real, legitimate orders, then yes, my accuracy would probably be 99.5%. So what we really want to focus on is our true positive and our false positive. So we want to catch as many actual fraud events as possible and stop them as fast as we can. But at the same time, we don't want our real customers being stopped, because some real orders do look a bit fishy as well. So the aim is to maximize your true positive whilst minimizing your false positive. And that can sort of be done through some evaluation techniques. So part of the problem with fraud is you're stopping an event in progress. So how do you know that it actually was fraud or not? So to start with, if we take our offline example, we haven't put this into production yet. We're just using a test set of 1 month. So we've got our high volume company, 2% of all orders are expected to be fraud, and we're going to say that each item costs about £500. And then there's an additional cost to consider, which is how much is a human reviewer. So for this Eevee scenario, it's going to be £5 per order. But we have our lower volume, higher cost items on our Snorlax Trading Card, our Snorlax Spa Breaks, but their human reviewers are slightly cheaper. So AWS Fraud Detector is extremely expensive to run predictions. It is 3 cents per prediction, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you've got 100,000 orders coming in monthly, and you want to test every single one, you've suddenly got thousands of dollars of AWS bills to pay. So for my testing, I always take a sample of about 1,000, with known legit or fraud values. And so I start with a sample of 100 fraud events. So 100% of the sample is fraud, 0% are legit. If my model is predicting that 98% of those are fraud, I'm happy to carry on. Then I do a 50-50 split of legitimate to fraudulent orders. And then finally, a sample of my 2% fraud against 98% legit to see, can it still pick out that signal when there's fewer orders going in? And then if you're happy with that, and your true positive and false positives are matching what you're prepared to gain or potentially lose, then we move on to looking at our actual features. So to help our human reviewer, we want to give them as much information as possible. So Fraud Detector does provide some importance of your variable weightings. And so typically we would give them the 5 most important values and explain to them what they mean. And they can put that in the context of the fraud score to see, does the fraud score actually make sense? Some of these, so you might notice the bottom one has a score of 0. Typically, when you're putting in loads and loads of different variables, some will have no impact at all. So this is where, to improve your model, you might want to combine features together, have fewer features going in, but also that top feature has so much more importance than any of the others. It might have too much weighting, so that's something to consider as well that you might want to adapt. This brings us on to the power of feature engineering. So we've evaluated offline. Now we want to make some improvements. Before we can move on to further evaluation, let's look at what else AWS Fraud Detector can do for us. So Fraud Detector provides variable enrichment. So they have their own databases of fraudulent email addresses, home addresses, contact numbers that they can add into your data. And something that works really well for our trading cards company is our triangulation with our geolocation enrichment. So we can take a billing address, an IP address, a shipping address, and Fraud Detector will use those to perform some calculations to see, do these look really suspicious? Was this order placed in a completely different country to the billing address? Is the shipping address in a different country? Just things like that to help improve our model. So now we want to deploy. For our high volume orders, I've always used SageMaker. I think that their pipelines are really powerful, like you can get a lot of information through very quickly, but for our lower volume orders, a Lambda might be more appropriate. Just remember you've got your 15-minute timeout, so you can have one Lambda bringing your data in, setting up your predictions, and then another one extracting that data, removing the personal information, and sharing your relevant results with the relevant people. Okay, so now we move on to our actual live trial, and we've got our human reviewers. But remember, our human reviewers have their own bias. So even if they've spent years and years looking at suspicious orders, as soon as you say, I've got this AI model and it's got a number, that's going to push all of their experience. Like, it's going to have a bigger impact, and your model might not actually be that strong. So something that you can do while your reviewers kind of get used to the new tech, for our low-cost orders that have a fast turnaround of 1 month. So if you're selling a product to someone, they've got a 30-day period to return that. If they haven't returned it in 30 days and you've not collected a payment, it's a fraudulent order. So we could just watch these. We're already losing money on fraud, so 1 more month isn't really that much more of a loss if you think about it. But you can just track those against what your reviewer thought were fraud and thought weren't, and feed that back to your reviewer, feed it back into your model. And then for our high-cost items, so typically with services and that, you might not see chargebacks for up to a year, sometimes even longer depending on which bank you're with. So there would be more of an emphasis on investigating, giving them more information, more time to make a decision, perhaps the opportunity to reach out to the customer and speak to them directly. That's just a way that you can sort of navigate and making sure that your results are looking right. So how often should we retrain our models? So with our slower moving trends, we don't need to be retraining that often. Quarterly or around sort of like big events in the calendar might be appropriate, or just when your features start to drift a bit. But with our fast-moving trends, monthly is appropriate. If your trends are changing every 4 weeks, you might even want that to retrain faster. I've always found that monthly sort of works quite well. And then what frequency should we generate our predictions? So everyone wants that information as much as they possibly can, but as fast as they possibly can. But if you're selling a good and you've got a delivery shipment, you could potentially have that out of your warehouse within a couple of hours. So you need that information as fast as you can get it. But if you're selling a service, then you could potentially wait a couple of days. You don't necessarily need to action your fraud order immediately. But there are limitations with using Fraud Detector in that you can't have it completely real time because it can only process one set of batch predictions at any time. So you could take the previous hours of orders and put them in that way. And that's something else you would need to consider in your feature engineering is, can you actually get that information processed within the hour so that you can then move on to your next batch prediction on time? And then what are we actually counting as fraud? So I mentioned earlier that each order receives a fraud likelihood score. And you can see from this sort of moving bar that you can set your threshold at different points, and everything above this threshold would get reviewed by your human reviewer. So when we've got the case of sort of quite general trends, there's so many different trends that can happen when you're selling goods, you might want a set threshold based on your capacity of reviewers, so say 800 or 900, you could change it throughout the year. But when you've got really distinctive trends and actually fewer orders, a moving threshold might be more appropriate, so you might want to just look at the top 100 that are coming through. And then continuous improvement. So this might sound a bit counterintuitive, but how much fraud should you allow to happen? If you're constantly retraining your model needs fraudulent data that is definitely fraud, because we can make decisions saying, yes, this is fraud, we think this is fraud, we think it's not fraud, but we will never completely know because the event never completed. We've interrupted it. And so that's always just something to consider based on like your risk score as a business and like what are you prepared to lose. Should you let through a small percentage so that you've got something in your that you can retrain on that is like accurate. But yeah, so to conclude, I just wanted to point out here that these have all followed the same stages but had different actions at both. So monitoring and evaluating is shaped completely by the business in the context of your data, and it's not necessarily just the technical constraints around it. And that was my biggest takeaway from working on this project across two fictional companies. So I'd just like to say thank you to Fuzzy Labs for organising the event. Thank you, Matt, for helping me practice. Thank you to the Awaze data science team for letting me ramble on about this. And thank you to Matillion for hosting us. So I'm Daisy Doyle, and this is the link to my LinkedIn. I do sometimes check my messages, but you can catch me at the break, so thank you.